We are not merely distracted, we are divided. We are not merely overwhelmed, we are disoriented. And until we name what it means to become whole, we will continue mistaking noise for life. So here's the question: what does it actually mean to be centered in a chaotic world? Welcome to Centered, Becoming Whole in a Chaotic World. This is a podcast about orientation, integration, and the lifelong work of becoming whole. I am your host, Dr. Jeff Armstrong, a PhD exercise physiologist with a deep interest in the intersection of the physical and the spiritual. My guest is Wayne Lehrer, a lifelong explorer of health, purpose, and human potential, who despite decades of study and teaching, found himself facing what he calls a third act identity crisis as he entered his 60s. In this conversation, we'll explore what it means to lose and redefine the self and how this often overlooked transition may be a critical path to becoming whole. Wayne, welcome back to my many podcasts. You've been on the Aging Well podcast with me. You were one of my early guests on We Have a Spiritual Problem. And now as we're making this transition to centered, becoming whole in a chaotic world, you were one of the first people I thought of to have on this podcast as a guest. And so I'm excited to have a conversation with you today about our fragmented society and really how we can orient ourselves, and just speaking from your experience. So welcome. It's my pleasure to have you here today.
Thanks, Jeff. It's great to be here with you again.
And so let's kind of just jump into things right away. Was there a pivotal experience in your life that forced you to kind of reconsider how you were living?
I guess there were a couple. The first one happened in my late 40s. I guess that would have been my midlife crisis, as opposed to what I call the third act identity crisis. And I guess those are the 2 points. The midlife crisis happened after I had been a designer. I designed World's Fairs. I'd been a filmmaker. I made IMAX movies and designed theme parks and museums. And I had just finished designing a bunch of pavilions for a World's Fair in South Korea. And I made the 3D IMAX film that was voted best film in the expo. And a week before the World's Fair opened, the company that hired me sent me back to America. And I was shattered by that because, my identity, I was finally going to get the acknowledgement and the kudos and the payoffs I'd worked really hard for, and it was taken from me. And it just broke something inside of me. And I didn't know that I was re-examining everything. But as I said, I was shattered, and I kind of limped along kind of as a victim for a while. And it's not that I didn't continue doing that. I did the first live action and computer generated characters kids show on TV. I continued to do some design work. I did a lobby of a casino in Atlantic City that had a miniature version of Bryce Canyon in it, in the lobby. And, so I still was doing stuff, but there's something in me was like off. I was no longer in the program of either fake it till you make it or prove myself through big success. And that went along for a while. And, and then I found my way into teaching yoga and meditation just through a series of weird events, and found a new identity in that. And then at around 60, 65, my body started breaking down, and I'd been bulletproof my whole life. And we're not talking about big things. We're talking about small things, maybe not small to other things, and certainly not small in any time but 2020s, but I needed a knee replacement. I had a small hernia operation, this and that. And I hadn't been to a doctor more than once or twice in 30 years. So for me, it was I was no longer bulletproof. And that fragility, along with having not quite gotten back on board with this idea of competing and striving and succeeding and gathering and collecting and building an identity, I was left sort of questioning, and it opened me up to a whole new way of thinking. And that was sort of the beginning of my journey in terms of what I have since come to call my third act.
That's why I love conversations with you, because it really points me in the right direction. I mean, I've never come away from a conversation with you where I haven't felt a little bit more oriented, a little bit more centered. And so one of the themes of this podcast is fragmentation. And so where do you see people most divided or disoriented in today's society?
All people, or people in their third act?
I'd say pretty much all people. And I think, the discussion might kind of lead to, does that disorientation change as we move through? I mean, you speak of 3 acts. Are we disorientedly different? Disorientedly? Is that a word?
Yeah, exactly.
Disorientedly different as we progress through those 3 acts.
I think, I think that, well, first of all, I believe that most people live, for the most part, from the neck up. They decide what they're going to do when they're in a time of struggle. They don't necessarily turn to a higher power or something that's go to meditation or do something that's stilling and centering. They usually try to figure it out. They get all anxious and fragmented, as you say, and then function from that place of the sympathetic nervous system of fight, flight, and freeze. And, and then it's just do whatever you can as fast as you can and as much as you can. So I think that, and I think that I always joke and say, one of the worst things that happened in America that we can really see has progressed a long way since it happened was at Starbucks, they went to calling the smallest cup a tall. That was the beginning of lies beginning to be okay, as a metaphor, right? Because when was a tall the smallest thing? Yes, large means the largest, but tall, it was always like small, medium, and, tall, or, whatever. And, but that whole idea of it being okay and there being relatively, I was a single dad. One of the most challenging things about being a single dad was that, my son didn't have that much accountability. I was at the peak of my career. I was traveling back and forth to Korea. He moved in with me. He called me up one day at 12 and said, I'm ready to live with you. And I said, get your mother on the phone. And we talked. And she said, yeah, he's ready. And, her and I had always had a good, continued to have a good relationship. And I said, well, could he wait a few months? And then he moved in. And, and the problem with being a single parent in this society is, there's very little accountability. Teachers can't hold it. Your teachers used to hold you accountable. Where's your homework? Yeah. Go sit in the corner. Go to the principal's office. Principal used to be able to hold you accountable. Society had lots of things in there for accountability, and there are probably zero these days. Besides the fact that most kids come from a home where both parents are working, so from the get-go, accountability is really low, and of course you're going to be fragmented, because not just are you overwhelmed with so many things, not are we, going to social media and seeing bizarre things, at our friends' homes and on TV and on social media, but, we got nowhere to talk that stuff out and to get back to ground zero, get back to some sort of centered place. And then as we age, those things don't come in. We go to a job, most of us enter a job, and we're over our head. We may have studied for it. We may even have a degree in it. But, we're thrown into the mix. And, a lot of people don't have managers that pull them aside and say, these are what my expectations are. I expect you to have a 6-month learning ramp. Don't worry about it. There's no pressure. That's not what happens, So between pressure, between constant overload, and between and a lack of any accountability, and the fact that we're really not taught and supported from role to role either. So, and that's just in the face of the fact that we're confronted with 8,000 advertisements a day. People don't realize that when you're walking down the street, when I was a kid, no one wore shirts with any writing on them, with no words. The only thing there was the Izod logo of the alligator. That was it. No one even wore baseball caps. You didn't even wear, I'm from LA, you didn't wear a Dodgers cap. That it was unheard of, right? maybe a little bit. Every time you see a shirt that's got something on it, you silently to yourself say that word. That's very disruptive. Like you may be moving along with a thought and your mind is going, Dodgers, Givenchy, whatever it is, billboard, radio, some girl in a low-cut top, all of those things. So, yeah, I think we're on overload, and I think we don't have most of us don't have a ground zero. Both internally and externally. Someone or some community that we work things through with, and the wherewithal to find a place where we get silent, where we don't turn on the TV, where the radio isn't on, where we sit in nature, where we practice meditation or do yoga. So, how could we be anything other than fragmented?
So let's talk a little bit about it, or becoming a little bit more integrated. And I like to kind of stick to what we call the SPIES model, spiritual, physical, intellectual, emotional, and social, becoming aligned in those. That's really what we're talking about when we talk about being centered. So let's start with the spiritual. How do you keep transcendence from becoming abstract or theoretical in your life?
Wow. I think a number of things. First of all, the simplest answer of all is a friend of mine, Kathy Smith, says, win the morning and win the day. If the first thing you do in the morning, the average person, they do one of two things first thing in the morning. They either check their phone or they turn on their coffee machine, pretty much. And then they go to news, and then so straight away. So win the morning and win the day. If you haven't set the tone for your day as centering, introspective, a plan, a schedule. So I think if we're talking about being broken off from the self, the first thing in the morning, we need to connect with the self. My morning starts with, I get out of bed, I get on my knees, I pray for a second. I then do a kind of a meditative practice. I make this anti-inflammation drink, that's ginger and cayenne and turmeric, and in that process of making it, I don't just turn on any instant thing. I have to grate the ginger and the turmeric, and so I do that. I have a group that I meet with 5 days a week, 6 days a week usually, a meditation group. So that's a 20-minute meditation, and then we share together. From there, I usually go to the beach where I go alone, I run and walk, and then I jump in the ocean. So I've had a pretty good day by 9 o'clock. I'm ready to then sit down and start writing. So I think that's like, one of the simplest and most critical ways to approach this issue. Meditation, some exercise, something healthy, not immediately loading yourself up with a big breakfast that makes you unconscious because it's got tons of carbs and sugar and too much protein or whatever it is, not overloading yourself with caffeine and getting all jittery from that, not spending the first half hour of your day on the phone and getting sucked into everybody else's reality but your own. And then, of course, when you've done that, you've already started. There was a theory early on I heard about cancer, and that what cancer was that the centers of our cells in our body were no longer had the strength to hold the cells together, and the cells started exploding and proliferating. It was a weird thing, but the idea is that if we're not centered, we're going in every direction. And so not only just starting the morning, but kind of having, I happen to be self-employed. And if you're self-employed, it's really a challenge to not drift from one thing and not to get distracted from one thing or another. So I find I have to anchor my day with things that I have regularly that I do. I write at a coffee shop. So I go to the coffee shop at a certain amount of time. I usually take a break and take a walk some point during the day on quiet tree-lined streets. I then come home, I make my own lunch, another process. Not everybody has the freedom and the wherewithal to do that, but I think getting into the headset that if you're not organizing your day, you don't own it. And there's no chance of what you call transcendence if you're not even present, you know. So the key is to do whatever you can to get present, and then to know that the world is constantly conspiring to pull you out. And then if you take it to the next level, who do you spend your time with? Do you spend your time with people that complain all the time, or that are caught up in incredible conspiracy theories that where their angst gets communicated to you way more than the conspiracy theory? And that angst comes into your psyche as something that you leave that conversation with, and you may not be seeing the same conspiratorial worldview in front of you, but you're certainly looking at the world with a little bit of angst. This idea that watching violence on TV doesn't make us violent. When I was a kid, the only, you watched any any cop show, Dragnet, FBI, no one got shot. You didn't see blood coming out in slow motion. You didn't, so, what we put in certainly affects what we come out. Another level of accountability. And if I can't have the society having any kind of regulatory effect on what's going into my head, I have to be the caretaker of my own reality. And that may be the big, I think organizing your day around positively self-centered activities and being a caretaker of your reality are probably two of the best things I could suggest.
I like that. And I've tended to start using more the phrase the transcendent self, as opposed to like self-centered, because I think a lot of times we orient ourselves when we think of self-centered, it's only about me.
Yeah.
And it's, what am I doing for me? And then on the other end, you could be so selfless that you totally ignore your own well-being. But that idea of transcendent self is where we're actually engaging in the universe as we are going inward. We're doing the things that are preparing us to be more impactful in our world. And I think that's exactly what you just spoke.
Yeah.
And so let's move on to physical. What physical disciplines anchor you personally? I know you do yoga, and you talked about going to the beach and swimming at the beach and running.
Yeah, I do meditation every day, oftentimes twice a day, 20 minutes in the morning and again in the afternoon some days, not every day. Yeah, I can tell you that with age, my exercise looks much different than it did before. Now my exercise is to maintain my well-being at all times, as opposed to get bigger muscles, look better, any of that kind of stuff. Those things all get taken care of. So, I go to the gym, I spend 30 minutes in the gym. I do a push day and a pull day. The push day is all the exercises that are pushing muscles, and pull day, so I'm sure you know what that is, and most people do. That way I'm giving a rest day, so I do that 2 days on, I take a day or two off, and then I do 2 days again. So I'll do push, pull, take a day or two off, push, pull. I hike regularly. I go to the beach and walk between 2 and 3 miles. I run walk. I'll walk, and that's the healthiest form. Even if you can't run, when you get older, you can always kind of integrate the idea of HIIT training, which I think is one of the single best inventions that's happened. Because I think that one of the things that has to do with the physical part of self-care, especially as you age, is because your metabolism tends to slow down, anything that jumpstarts your metabolism is really important to do. So if you're walking at a comfortable pace, you're never really getting your heart beat up. And it's one of the big things about cold plunges and saunas. As long as you're changing your body's response all the time, you're keeping your body actively sensing, adapting, resilient, and those are really important qualities. What else do I do physically? Uh, I have a series of stretches I do at home. I do yoga about 3 or 4 days a week, and the yoga I stretch for 10 minutes most days, and on my yoga days, it's an hour, hour and a half, hour and three quarters one day. Hour most days, and on Sundays I teach a class that I usually do along with my students. And so, I think that, you got to build muscle, you got to maintain muscle, and you have to keep your muscles flexible. The joints have to be mobile, they have to move in every direction regularly. This idea that rigor mortis starts setting in at 30 or 40 years old is insane, but it's true for most people. Rigor mortis happens 6 hours after you die. It shouldn't be happening long before that, and yet, because we usually exist in only 2 or 3 planes, up and down, forward and backward, side to side, we don't do all of the other movements that are required. The spine has got 33 moving joints in it. It's meant to move on all those joints. Most of us move in 2 or 3 places, and because of that, the wear and tear. So mobility, resiliency, range of motion, muscle maintenance, and then, of course, I think pivotal, well, certainly when you age, is to do things. To give your body the time to integrate every one of those things. So, for example, one of the things, most people eat and then they're right off to the next thing. And I was sitting with a friend the other day. I watched him stuff a croissant in his face, and he's 80 pounds overweight. It's like, and he's somebody I coach, somebody I work with personally. I said, if you just change the way you'd eat, you change the way you do everything, your body would work better, and just become aware of the fact. So our body requires, one of the greatest things that's happened in the last couple decades is this idea of intermittent fasting, which was it's no great invention. It's what we did when we were cavemen. It's what we did for millions of years. You ate, you went and worked in the field for 4 or 5 hours. You ate again. You didn't eat between meals, right? You came home and you ate again, maybe, around dark. And then you had 10, 12, 14, 16 hours again into your next meal. That was how we were designed to work. If your intestines are working all the time, no wonder your lower intestine gets blocked up and you're full of, So that's what I do for the physical level.
And I was going to ask you about nutrition, and you covered that, so that's awesome. So how about the intellectual piece? What do you think are some of the most distorting ideas that are distorting human flourishing today?
Wow. Well, I think it goes back to being the caretaker of your reality. Like, because nobody is monitoring what goes on Netflix, nobody's monitoring what your children are listening to on a streaming thing on their phones. It kind of falls on us, and most of us weren't taught how to do that. So controlling, we've got portals into this thing that you put under the concept of spies, right? These let in visual information. These let in auditory information. That we take food in through our mouths, we breathe through our nose. If we're not monitoring those things, then we're the victim of whatever randomly society is putting in front of us. So intellectually, what are you filling your head with? Like I already said, if you're watching violence, it's hard to not think that it's okay. And it's not even a thinking process because it goes into the subconscious. So first thing, I think that most of us need to do some real work on, in the 12-step world, which I happen to be a part of, there's this process that when you come in, at one point you do what's called the 4th step, and the 4th step is taking account of all of the people you've hurt in your life, of all the resentments you're carrying. How can I be available to life if my brain is filled with remembering all the times I did something abusive, all the times I lied. Now, those things have gone into my subconscious mind, but because they're in my subconscious mind doesn't mean that they're not impacting. Modern psychology has told us that the thing that impacts all of our action is the subconscious mind putting a flavor on everything based on the fact that it expects that whatever we're doing now is going to be a replication of something that happened in the past that we still have trauma around. Was that clear?
That's very clear. I like that.
So, and as a result of that, if we haven't fully digested, because all trauma is undigested experience. If I'm running on the trail and I twist my ankle, and I then don't just take the time to move it in circles, and in other words, to let it adapt to that overstretch, and it might mean I don't walk on it for a few days. If I don't let it acclimate and become healthy again. Same thing if something's traumatically has happened to me, I bury that feeling because there's no way to deal with it in the moment, and I never come back to it. So at some point, I've got to come back to all those things because they've cluttered up my internal landscape, cluttered it up, and therefore flavor, poison, filter become an overlay on everything that happens later. And then, of course, what do I put in, and what am I doing for inspiration? So after I've sort of cleaned up the old trash and monitored what comes in, what am I putting in for inspiration? Am I listening to podcasts that are uplifting and inspiring? Am I meditating and praying in a way where I'm receptive to hearing from what you call the transcendent self, from the higher self? And am I then acting on that? Because the stuff that comes into the transcendent self are, in my mind, they're the words of God. They're how I speak to the higher power, to the universe, and it's my job to then do my part to bring that into the world. And so part of my intellectual time is spent translating that into creative endeavors. You're currently writing a book. I've written several books. I'm writing my first novel. I give talks and stuff like that. All of that stuff requires for me to stay in that place where I'm monitoring what goes in. I'm dealing with feelings in real time. I think most people would benefit tremendously from going to therapy, and there's some great new kinds of therapy out there that that what you put under the terminology of intellectual, in other words, anything that affects my ability to function on the mental plane, are things that I need to address. So,
and that leads right into the next step in the SPIES model, which is the emotional dimension. So where do you see emotional reactivity undermining otherwise intelligent individuals?
Well, I think most people, they're the victim of it, and they don't even realize that they play a part in it. And that may be, one of the biggest challenges for us as a culture. There's a man in the 60s, 70s, Werner Erhard, and he said, if you want to know what you intended, look what you got. And I think the fact is that we think that things happen to us. And emotionally, what we've come to understand is that we're just creating our own reality all the time. If somebody, I was with a friend yesterday, and somebody hit his car and drove on, and a camera caught it. And when he told him that it was a person that he knew that lived on his street, and the guy called him up and said, "Hey, I found out that my insurance let me know that I'd hit your car." And the guy, on the camera, we saw the car stop, right? And then my friend left him, and when he heard the guy's thing, and he was like, "You idiot. Yeah, you knew what you were doing. You're lying to me straight up now." But that triggered something in him. And so he said, your company told you? I saw you stop. Well, that was an emotional charge he had because sometime in his life he's done a hit and run, and by hit and run I'm talking metaphorically, but he had actually done a hit and run in his life. But we all do hit and runs, you know. I drop a piece of paper on the ground and I keep going, I keep walking as though it didn't happen, right? Those are all ways in which we lie to ourselves emotionally, and they all end up affecting everything that we do. Um, so I kind of already got into this, but I think that really looking at our past and looking at our trauma, there's a new therapy out there that I happen to like a lot. It's called internal family systems, where you see all of your various parts. You know, you see the hurt child, you see the punishing father, you see the loving mother, whatever things you've internalized, and you see that usually you're functioning from those parts, and all those parts haven't been reintegrated into a healthy person. That one of them gets triggered, and that's where you're acting from. And I think unless we really look back on our lives and take responsibility for the fact that, you know, yes, I was the victim of an alcoholic father who happened to hit me a lot, but I spent the next 55 years keeping him alive in my memory by hating him, instead of doing the emotional work to get to the place where I forgave him, because in his mind, because his father had left and hadn't helped raise him, in his mind, he had done his best job by getting us a home, feeding us regularly, buying us clothes, and supplying all of our needs. So that was a home run for him. When I finally understood that, I could begin to get to forgiveness, you know, and as you know, you're around my age, you know, it used to be okay to hit your child with the strap, you know, that was okay. I mean, now it's seen as, you know, child abuse,
Yeah.
but in that worldview. And so, but I still had to integrate the fact that I had all these stories around it, and all the stories were keeping me from being able to show up for my life. So I think the work we do in therapy, and then this thing about, another thing that the 12-step world talks about a lot, pause before acting. You know, we're when you even use the term reactivated, right? We get reactivated by these buried traumas, these buried memories, and we're off to the races. If you pause for a second, your life would be a lot less messy. Not you personally, any of us.
I would be a lot less messy, yes.
Yeah, I know all of us would, right? And you know, pause before taking an action is like that. That's like kindness 101, right? I have a friend, he says, when in doubt, be kind, be kind, be kind. You know, I still need to deal with my side of the feelings. Even if I'm kind, I still now am the recipient of all those feelings that a situation may have generated in me that did not necessarily evoke kindness, even though I may have acted kindly. I mean, obviously the world would be a lot better place if people acted kindly and, you know, didn't necessarily clean up their personal messes. But it'd be way better if they actually looked at their history and looked at their trauma and took some responsibility and moved out of this place of being the victim of their parents and of authorities and of, you know, situations that were, you know, foisted on them, and you know, whatever it was, and realized that they detracted most of those things in their life, and they stayed for whatever abuse there was there, you know. And yes, it's true that in a lot of circumstances we can't escape the abuse, but we can begin to deal with the abuse that we give ourselves from that point in time onward.
Such great wisdom. And I feel like I can dive into that and we'd be here another 2 hours. So I'm going to kind of move it on just for your sake. Let's talk social. What does real community require in your mind?
So in my worldview, in what I talk about in my book a little bit, I think in our first act, you know, our first sense of community for a lot of us should be a healthy family, right? And if you haven't come from a healthy family, it may be hard to ever establish a place, a way for yourself to be comfortable in community, and also somebody that invokes and invites community and builds community. So in the first act, we're independent, we're dependent. And in a dependent state, we recognize the necessity for community, a mom and a dad, brothers and sisters, a house that we live in, a relatively safe neighborhood. Imagine, we're blessed. Most of us live in a place where we live in a home. We've got all of the necessities met. We live in a relatively safe community, although that's really been threatened big time in the last 20 years. But for the most part, we live in these relatively safe feelings of I'm a part of something, right? And so to not feel a part of something, if those are threatened straight away, community is always going to be a challenge. Intimacy is always going to be a challenge. Cooperation may not be a part of it. A lot of times in the face of those struggling or uncomfortable communities, cooperation happens, and so a new form of community is built, us against them, let's say. In the second stage of life, community becomes a little more amorphous, and because it's the time we're building more of our sense of self from 20 to 60, we're accumulating, we're mastering, we're giving our talents, we're using our talents to achieve and accumulate stuff. That's the period of time of independence. And a lot of people never graduate from that independent state. And that independence, which obviously, we've now got names for when it goes off the rails: narcissism, sociopath, self-centered. So, and all of those things obviously work against any sense of community. And if we're working at a job where we're always in competition against somebody else to get to the next rung up the ladder, or in our family, if we're not the golden child, or at school, if Johnny always does better on his things, or Susie does better, is better at math, those things all move us more and more into that separate self. And I believe that one of the greatest gifts of getting older is that we become dependent again, but in a new way. And so I call the third act interdependence. And interdependence is really, so in the third act, community becomes really important. And community, collaboration, giving back to society instead of, second act is a lot about what can I get for me and mine? What can I accumulate to be safe in this world, to have enough? When we get older and we're not as good at competing, accumulating, it doesn't work as well. Now, we may still use the next level of accumulating, which is holding on and not giving anything away or giving back. But this idea of building community and of being connected is something that really requires a lot of discipline, and also a lot of proactiveness that aren't required. So if, let's say, you're 55 or 60 and you retire from your work, that was a community that you were part of. It may not have been a healthy community. You may have only had a few friends there, no intimates, and a number of acquaintances, and a lot of alliances, which are kind of negative relationships in a way. We know people that live only in alliance. What can I get from you? This is the exchange rate between us for whatever the thing is. But all of a sudden you leave that community called my job, and 200 people are out of your life all of a sudden. Now, they may not have been your closest friends, but they were something that you felt a part of. Not being a part of something leaves a huge hole. And not only are you not seeing them at the when you go to get your coffee, but you're also not seeing them throughout the course of a day, and that's a huge hole. And for a lot of men who've made most of their friends at work or in sports, all of a sudden to have to go make friends, with new people that they cross paths with is very challenging. So, anyways, that's one thing. So I think it's incumbent upon us that we choose communities that we value. So I happen to be in a bunch of different communities, and I happen to be the center of a few communities. I currently teach classes at a senior living facility, and I go in there regularly and I meet with the people, and they call it group therapy. It's not group therapy. It's creating community. It's creating intimacy. And these are people, a lot of the people, I'll watch them. Like yesterday, someone came in the room who everybody in the room and in the group that had been forming over a while said never leaves their room. Now all of a sudden, and they shared. In fact, once they started sharing, they wouldn't stop sharing. They were so desperate to be a part of something, right? So this idea of community, we really got to go out of our way for it. So I happen to be in the 12-step community. I'm in the place I swim at. That's a community. I write at a coffee shop because I'm desperate for community. Otherwise, writing is something, I've got this view. I've got a 10-mile view of nothing but nature and mountains out there. And that's what most writers love. I would go crazy if I wrote from here. I've written 10 pages in my 20 years of writing, sitting at this desk with this view. I go to a coffee shop, and in the coffee shop, I've got another community. And my friends joke, "Are you at the office?" They know to come, and that's another community that they become a part of. And we die if we're not connected. And we don't know that anymore because the society was like, strive, stand out, beat your fellow man, excel beyond your, compatriots. And community hasn't really been fostered, short of church for most people. And then, like I said, the other things start, and then the integral community for a lot of us is the family. And if you're older, your kids start moving away, and maybe you've gotten some distance with your wife and you recognize, or your husband, and you recognize the only thing you had in common for the last 10 years was the kids, and they're gone, and all of a sudden that community is gone. So there's a lot of work that has to be done to do that. And we live in a place now where it's not understood. Whereas, again, for the first couple 100,000 years of our existence, we lived in communities. In fact, I don't know, I'm sure you've heard of the study, but the healthiest group of people that you can have is less than 300. Because in a group of 300 people, you get to know everybody. You can know everybody's name. You can form your little groups within that, your little communities that feed different sides of yourself. That's an important part of community too. Yeah. I need to have a side of myself that's fed emotionally. That may be a completely different community than the people I do creative stuff with or intellectual stuff, or that I do sports or work with. So that's my 2 cents on community.
That was more than 2 cents, but that was awesome.
$1.95. It was on sale today.
Yeah, I don't think we get 2 cents anymore. Inflation. So, how about looking at kind of your habits? What habit do you think has most transformed your life?
I guess for me, I would have to say self-reflection and taking responsibility. Those two go together. Sort of what I was sharing about, I'd done meditation my whole life. It never really changed my core self. The trauma that's put in on the hard drive is put in on the hard drive. It's there. If it's not rewired, if it's not short-circuited, if it's not given a new pattern, that new pattern can't exist until I recognize, A, that it's there and that it's running me, and B, then start doing contrary actions and start practicing qualities that I perceive as, things that I admire as the higher aspects of being a human, from the transcendent self. So yeah, I think that, whether it was therapeutic or going through the 12-step process or doing some various workshops I've done in the course of my life, things where I got to know how I functioned on the unconscious level, what my needs were, so that I could actually become my own loving parent, as they say, and then having a supportive community that I can start embodying that knowledge in and those principles in, and who could also hold me accountable to the way that old person still showed up in a loving fashion. I would say that was the most pivotal thing for me, because I had done so many things that were quote unquote spiritual or intellectual or therapeutic, and none of them really changed it. I had to be part of a conscious community. I had to really reflect on the history and how I had internalized it and how it ran me now. And then I had to begin to take new actions within that community, within those healthy communities, where the reflection came back and the payoffs came back, where all of a sudden people want to be your friend. I remember, my esteem was in such a place, and this may not be true for everybody, but I remember I used to walk into a room that I'd never been in before, that, you can feel, many people feel this when they go into a party, and it's like, okay, and I would walk in and people would think, what are you doing here? And a lot of us walk in the room and we feel immediately like, where do I fit in? Any questions we have about our lovability. If you've integrated all that stuff, you walk into a room and you just go and say hi to the first person. All of a sudden, everybody's your friend, right? But you got to transform those old issues that keep you from feeling comfortable enough to walk into the room and be an integrating force, to be an uplifting force, to generate that kind of loving kindness and thoughtfulness and interest in others.
So, do you believe human life is moving towards something? And if so, what?
I do. I think that we're at a pivotal point. This is semi-political. I think we're at a pivotal point where, you know what happened? They say, scientists, that humans, when I was in grade school, it was taught that in the chain of evolution, we went from Neanderthal to, Cro-Magnon, or human, and then Homo erectus, right? But they found out that that Neanderthals didn't become humans. Humans were a completely different evolutionary chain, right? So, but I do believe that we're at a place right now that you could metaphorically say is the leap between between Neanderthal and human. And I think we're at a place that we're moving from, because here's what in my mind what it boils down to, and whether we make it or not is completely out of my hands at this point. I can only do what I can do, as you're doing your podcast, and I know you're doing it because you feel that this is what you can do. But I believe the real shift is from survival consciousness to grace. We've been told there is enough to go around. Not with 9 billion people growing by 1 billion people, pretty damn quickly at a time, but there's enough to go around. There's enough love, there's enough time, there's enough, and I remember when the hole was in the ozone from spray can, and all we did was get rid of spray cans, basically aerosol cans, and then they found something that sort of knit it back together. Everyone thought that was the end for a moment. So we've been at end times many times, and we're highly adaptive. So, but I think the big shift is this shift from survival consciousness. There's not enough. I got to get mine, and those bring out all of our worst behavior. And the leaders of countries, we see a lot of leaders of a lot of countries right now that everything ends at the edge of their border. They're fighting to get more resources. They're taking from other places where there's resources, because the belief is there's not, and they've got followers that also believe there's not enough to go around. And then there's other people that actually think, well, if we all worked together, which is a huge shift. We haven't worked together. And even then we did. I mean, we worked together when we were a tribe, but it still became our tribe against their tribe when things were tight. And that's a whole other conversation about agrarian versus hunters and gatherers and stuff. But so I think that we are on a precipice. I think each time that we've gotten to this point, the stakes are way higher than they've ever been. it's hard for me to imagine them being much higher than they currently are, in terms of things I perceive as global warming and, abuse to our atmosphere and, the way we abuse people and, all of that kind of stuff. I think that we have to work together. I've always had this sort of idea in my mind. The only thing that was going to save us was obviously aliens wouldn't be good enough, that came and wanted to establish peace because we'd kill them. I think the only thing that would save us is a global event that was so powerful that everybody would have to work together, which was sort of the idea, and it actually did hold as a moment, was the moonshot, right? It was the first time when the entire planet was holding one thought. And, and there was a real feeling of peace that way. And so, yeah, I think how do we get to the place where we're working together and we're not trying to take from everybody else because we don't think there's enough? I think that's the big, $64,000 question.
All right, I like that. So I like to end every conversation with the same question. So if someone listening right now feels scattered or fragmented, and so many people do in our society, what is one step they could take this week to begin becoming more centered?
I think coming up with their own morning ritual. I think starting the day on the right note, instead of jumping into their day and jumping into their gotta do's and jumping into their miserable life, taking a second, taking that pause, doing the things that are self-sustaining, that are uplifting, that raise their consciousness first thing in the morning. If I haven't raised it first thing in the morning, it's pretty unlikely that the things that come at me the rest of the day are going to do it for me. So, I think building a morning ritual, and, it doesn't take much, 5 minutes of meditation, not picking up your phone first thing. I write a gratitude list every single day. I send it to multiple people. I get gratitude lists from people. I've been doing it for 12 years now. There's 10 items I put on it every day. I try to make them relatively different all the time. If you start, when I teach yoga, one of my little Wayneisms is walk in gratitude, live in grace. So I think, starting the morning out, treating yourself well is starting the morning out with a sense of gratitude and that there is enough.
And we spell that gratitude with 2 T's because I believe it's an attitude of gratitude. So
I love that. Exactly.
This was awesome. Wayne, I always love having conversations with you, and I'm sure our listeners enjoy hearing from you as well. This has been a great conversation. We will certainly have you back on this conversation again. But just keep doing what you're doing, and just keep helping us find that center in our world, because I think the world is a little less chaotic with people like you in the world.
Yeah, thanks. I appreciate it.